Welcome back! Recently I was asked to take part in a Ferrari group build with the International Scale Modeler, so today we'll be building the Revell Ferrari F40 124. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell button, like and follow on Instagram. Also, a comment is always welcome. I do reply to all comments. Firstly, we'll have a look. You can see here that the body is moulded in one piece. Therefore, if you want to open the rear cowling, I suggest cutting it before painting. I forgot to, and later decided not to bother at all. Here I'm removing some flash and mould lines using some 600 grit sandpaper and the craft knife. The moulding is generally pretty good, but there are some obvious mould lines. Annoyingly, the spoiler is moulded in black, which means that you would have to cover it with quite a lot of primer to match the rest of the body. I don't see the point in moulding the body in one colour but then the spoiler in a different colour. Might as well all just be white. Here it is after a few coats of Tamiya white primer. I had to sand down around the joins to make it as smooth as possible. I then gave the car 4 coats of Wilko gloss red enamel. Still sanding down this joint using wet sand and about 600 grit sandpaper between some of the paint coats to make that as smooth as possible. Here it is after the 4 coats. I then began to put the engine together. I haven't recorded much of this. It goes together quite nicely. The moulding could be a little bit better. I've had a look at the Tamiya version and this one isn't quite as detailed. But it's based on the car when it was brand new. This car is based on the prototype version, so my guess is that maybe the engine changed design a little bit. Here I'm painting some of the belts by using some anthracite matte on the tip of a toothpick. This is a really good method for doing fine details. Did the tops of the block in some satin red. I sprayed the disc brakes in silver rust-oleum paint and then used some Tamiya copper for the brake calipers. I used Tamiya panel line to do the black line that goes around all corners of the car, and then masked off the little clips for the engine cover and the boot at the front. This worked quite well, but it was always important to have the cotton bud at hand in case there were any accidents. I then used some semi-gloss black to do the inside of the light housings. I think it's now starting to look like the real car. Rather than masking all the window trims at the same time, I went around section by section using the masking tape. Where there were any gaps, I filled them in using a bit of panel line accent. When it came to putting on the decals, they had got a little bit yellow with age, so I put them up in the window to help bleach them a little bit. However, my youngest son decided to pull them off the window and lose them. So I bought some replacements from Model Works. However, I found that the scale wasn't exactly right. So I had a bit more of a look in the bedroom and thankfully found the original decals. However, I did use one of the ones from Model Works. The Scuderia badges on the side went on quite nicely, just above the little release cap. I plan to use some photo etch for the little keyholes on the release caps. This car was based on the prototype, which was before they chose to put the embossed F40 logo on the rear spoiler. The one that came with the kit was in black, however one of the ones on the Model Works kit was red and looked more like it was embossed, so I chose to use that one instead. It's a shame because the Tamiya one does have an embossed rear spoiler instead, but I think it looks okay. Pininfarina logos go on both sides, just behind the door. I'm upgrading to the Google Pixel 3a this week, and I really hope that it focuses better than this camera phone. The dashboard of the car has a flocking-like felt material, and I decided to try and replicate this by using some embossing powder. This is called Earl Grey. I found it on the internet. Unfortunately though, it has a little bit of glitter in it. Initially I put down some anthracite matte to work as an adhesive, and then I poured it down over this split envelope. The envelope's quite useful because it has a natural fold in the middle. It means that I can gather up the excess afterwards. When I was doing the dashboard, I did it in stages to make sure that the paint wasn't drying whilst I was doing it. Obviously this is acrylic, which dries quite quickly. I made sure to not paint over things like the air vents and the instrument dials, and I quite like it. It's just a shame about the glitter. I later went over it in dark grey matte. I then decided to use some of this fine steel gauze for the rear grille. I felt that the one in the kit is okay, but you couldn't see through it enough, and therefore the engine would be quite hidden. Firstly, it's very important to use eye protection when doing something like this, as the material can be cut with scissors, but will create small bits of metal. Remember to gather up any pieces afterwards and put them in the bin. You may also want to wear thick gloves. I didn't, and I was very careful. Firstly, I cut it to size, making sure that I got it angled so that the mesh would be creating a diagonal appearance. Then I checked it against the real one to make sure that it was the right size, and also compared it to the opening at the back of the car. I put down a couple of coats of primer onto the mesh to make sure that the semi-gloss black enamel stuck down well, and I'm pretty happy with how it looks. I then used a new blade on a craft knife to very carefully trim away the original mesh. This was quite easy as there are already holes in the mesh, but you do need to be really careful as there are several parts from this which I want to keep, including the light housings and the surround. It was very gentle while prising this part away. You can see it fits quite well. I'll have to use super glue to put this together. It was then important to remove the light housings, which I did in very similar method using the craft knife and a much pointier blade this time to get into some of the small corners. I later went over it with a sanding stick to smooth down the backs and the edges. I also sanded the backs of them to thin them out a little bit and around the edge of the surround. I had to use some Gorilla Glue super glue to fix these parts together, as polycement wouldn't work on the metal. Important to hold this in place for quite some time. And then do the same with the light surrounds. Try to get them as symmetrical as possible. Let me know if you think I've improved this part. It's certainly a new technique that I've learned. Here you can see the finished engine. There were some small decals that went onto these vents on the top. I then went on to doing the front suspension. When painting the floor, I masked off the black parts and painted on the gloss red, and then went over with some brushwork on the other colours. All four of the disc brakes and calipers are identical. They have very little detail. I thought about adding to them, but you can't see them very much behind the wheels, so I decided not to bother. The engine has 4 little pins to put it into the right place, and you also need to make sure that the exhaust pipes go through the hole at the back. The hole is in the bumper part, which if you have cut it away from the rest of the body, you could put on at this point. This went together quite nicely. The interior of the F40 is incredibly Spartan. Most of it is bare carbon. There are no carpets, no CD player or radio, or even door handles or window wipers in this original version. I used masking tape and a pen in a very similar way to when I used felt for the carpets to create templates for this homemade carbon fibre decals. I had already painted the floor in a mixture of semi-gloss black and silver, and then used my semi-transparent carbon fibre decals to cover these up. Here you can see they're wet, and I tried to use some microsol and set to flatten them out as much as possible. But I was quite happy with how this turned out. I then used some dark grey matte for the rest of the flocked section, some silver and some panel line accent for the gear stick housing. I think this looks quite neat. I then added the decals and some extra detail to the dashboard and steering wheel. If I was doing this again, I think I probably would have done the decals before the embossing powder. The gear stick was from the chrome sprue, so I did the ball at the top with a little bit of black Sharpie over the top, as this maintained the gloss finish. The handbrake was simply semi-gloss black. I then used some photo etch buckles from this Tamiya wing set. I also used some sticky back velour, kind of like a velvet material, which I hadn't used before for the seatbelt material. However, I can really recommend this. There's a link above to a discussion video I did about various different seatbelt techniques. A lot of research and thought went into the making of that video, so I do recommend watching it. For the lap belt, I simply used one of the round buckles over a 2mm thin strip. For the shoulder straps, I used another 2mm thin strip, but this time a longer one. I found that if you peeled away the backing paper at one end, you were able to put the buckles through quite easily, but kept the backing paper on the other end so that it didn't stick to your finger. Micro tweezers are very useful at this kind of process. Also, just, be careful. I lost one buckle with 14 applied successfully, which is a pretty good success rate as far as things go. Once I had the buckle in place, I then compared it to the moulded straps which were on the seat to check that I was getting the position right. I didn't sand these off, as if had I done so, it would have removed some of the texture on the seat. I'm very happy with how this velour material looks. However, one of the downsides to it is that the decals don't stick to it due to the texture. So I left the backing paper on the decals and used some superglue to stick them on instead. Due to the sticky nature of them, these can just be pressed into place and they're really easy to use. I then applied some small clips to the backs of the seatbelt straps, which you'd be able to see behind the seat. As you can see from the picture, I think that these seats look pretty much like the real thing. I then used a little bit of superglue to fit them into place, being very careful not to get any on the carbon fibre decals. As you can see from this image, the original F40 door cards were very stripped back and simply had a cable behind them to pull the door open. I used a little bit of plastic tagging from a clothes label to replicate this, and I'm pretty happy with how it looks. I then put the dash in place and used a little bit of PVA to fit the window to separate the cockpit from the engine bay. Here you can see how it all fits together inside, and the interior of the car is nearly complete. I'm really satisfied with how this looks compared to the real version of the car, and I do really recommend this sticky back velour for seatbelts. For the wheels, I went over the 5 pointed spokes in flat aluminium but kept the surrounding chrome. I also used a photo etch centre locking clip. I did the front lip of the car in Tamiya matte black. The separate grille for the front air intake is much preferable to the Revell F40 where it's moulded. I put some plumbers aluminium tape on the back of the headlights, as this gave a nice amount of reflectivity which could also be glued onto without any risk of damaging the lights. The instructions didn't call for the window trims to be painted, however I felt it made a much more professional look. I will add a tinted edge to the sunstrip later. The insides of the light housings on the rear grille were simply done in Tamiya silver. I used my tried and tested method of using red and orange Sharpie for the tail lights, making sure to leave the centre of the orange ones clear, as you can see here. To do the tinted edge of the sunstrip, I masked off everything except the edge of the sunstrip, and then gave it a couple of coats of TS71 dark smoke. I was really happy with how this looked. However, I did have to use a little bit of thinners on the end of a cotton bud just to clean up a few places where it bled under. I added the clear parts using PVA and the rear grille using superglue. There were a few more parts that just needed to go into the engine bay. I also found that the exhaust pipes stuck out too far, so I used my clippers just to trim down these so that I could add the chrome tips. The last thing to add to the interior was the rear view mirror, which I added the reflectivity by using a bit of aluminium foil. This goes over the back so that you can fit it over the exhaust pipes first, and then I was really pleased with how this went on for such an old kit. It fit much better than the Revell Lamborghini Diablo, which is a slightly newer kit than this one. The 3 exhaust pipe tips went on nicely, and I used a little bit of panel line accents to add a little bit of depth. I then used some Model Factory Hero keyhole covers, and they might be screw heads, I'm not sure, but they work as both, to do some keyholes. I used 6 across the body, and this gave a really nice professional finish, I felt. The headlight covers that came with the kit were too plain, so I managed to find some 124 headlight covers from a damaged Bburago kit on eBay. I had to sand these into shape a little bit, but they had extra details such as lines that went across them. I did the edge of them in a little bit of black marker pen to simulate the rubber trim, and I was pretty happy with how this looked. The wing mirrors were done with chrome parts from the chrome sprue, and they fit on quite nicely. And here is the finished car. This is not bad for an old kit, and it's interesting that it's based on the prototype rather than the eventual version. I tried not to polish the car down too finely to leave a little bit of the carbon fibre weave sort of look underneath the paint job. I've also included some pictures comparing it to the later tooling of the F40. I think they're quite a nice pairing. And here it is. I hope you've enjoyed watching this. Please do comment below to tell me what you think. Have you built one of these? Have you built a Tamiya version, a Fujimi version, something different? Please do let me know, as I do reply to every single comment. Please like, share and subscribe. Hit that bell button to stay notified for the next build, and I'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye.